It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. We've got an action-packed show for you today about some things going on at the University of Louisville, and we've got some experts talking about subjects that are near and dear to our hearts and things in the news going on right now in the outside world. So what have we got coming up on today's show? Well, we've got Allan Josephson, and he is going to talk about the parents and kids who feel anxiety about those kids going off to college. So how should parents deal with that while their kids are going out of the house? And how can the kids deal with that, being away from home for the first time? We'll talk about that coming up a little bit later in the show. And in front of me right now is Justin Nix. He's a professor in criminal justice at UofL who's been working on several pieces of research around police shootings. He's looked at the so-called war on cops. Have more officers been shot since Ferguson, Missouri? He's looked at the Ferguson effect on officers. Has crime gone up because police are reluctant to engage suspects? And he studied whether unarmed blacks are more likely to get shot by police than unarmed whites. We're going to talk about all three of those pieces of research in the next 15 minutes or so. So welcome, Justin, back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's been kind of crazy in your world here the last couple of weeks with what has happened in Dallas and Minnesota and Baton Rouge. So let's talk a little bit about your research. What's your focus of your research in the criminal justice?
So currently I'm working on projects involving use of force by police, attacks against police, and then broadly police legitimacy and how citizens come to view the police as legitimate.
And what have you found in general in your various research? Everybody doing their job, police officers doing their job for the most part?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, the police are professional and they're out there doing their best every day. But what we see is that, critical incidents happen and they get captured on video and they go viral. And we tend to sort of extrapolate that and characterize law enforcement as having a problem, whereas it's an incident that, we need to look into further before we draw conclusions.
We've seen a number of incidents over the past couple of weeks. The real tragedy was down in Dallas where the police officers were shot and killed. And then we've had those two incidents, in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis. Let's talk about the study. I think you're still working on it, as I recall, about the shooting of unarmed black men or black citizens versus unarmed whites. What have you found so far? That doesn't correlate with what happened in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis, but we're just talking about your study. What have you found?
Right. So we took data compiled by the Washington Post. They've done an excellent job of tracking all fatal shootings by police officers over the last year and a half. And so we took the data from 2015, which was just under 1,000 citizens who'd been fatally shot by a police officer in the line of duty. And they collected all this information on whether the suspect had been armed, whether they showed signs of mental illness, what level of threat they posed to law enforcement or to others. And essentially what we found is that among those roughly 1,000 people who'd been fatally shot.
Was this just in the Washington area or was this nationwide?
This is nationwide,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Among those roughly 1,000 who'd been fatally shot, black suspects had been over twice as likely to have been unarmed than white suspects. Although in terms of whether they'd been attacking the police or others, there were no significant differences. But that unarmed finding, we think, is a sign of possible implicit bias by the police.
So in a nutshell, you're thinking that, and how many of those were shot by white police officers and how many of those were shot by black police officers, or did that make a difference?
Well, I can't tell you because that information isn't readily available. Okay. So the Washington Post is trying to obtain that information, but what they often find is that the police don't release it because it's an ongoing investigation.
So the bottom line finding, though, was that it implies at least that police officers are more fearful of a black suspect standing in front of them than they are a white suspect, and they're more likely to pull the trigger.
Correct. It suggests that they're falsely perceiving there to be a greater threat than there maybe actually is.
From a black suspect.
From a black suspect or a minority suspect.
From a minority suspect. Yep. And this was 1,000 cases nationwide. Mm-hmm. Was there any breakout of cops in big cities? Likely, or
sure.
Okay, go ahead.
We control for the size of the city, the size of the agency in terms of how many officers they employ. We control for crime according to the 2012 Uniform Crime Reports. We controlled for things like whether the agency operates its own training academy versus shipping its recruits off to a state-run academy. And what we found is that none of these things washed away that effect of race on having been unarmed at the time of being shot.
So it could be a police officer in Podunk, Missouri versus a police officer in downtown New York City. It's the same likelihood that they would shoot a black person that's unarmed more than they would a more likelihood than they would a white person's unarmed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would speak in likelihoods, but at least, we've controlled for those things, and we can confidently say that those factors don't erase the race finding that we came across. And I will point out that one of the problems with the data, as great as it was, is that it doesn't include non-fatal shootings. Anytime an officer pulls the trigger, the officer is using deadly force, and so we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. But we're working with what we have. It's the best data that we have, and this is what we find. And we think that we can take something away from it. But the bottom line is that we need better data.
What have cameras meant to cameras that are on the police officers now? What have those meant in terms of anything regarding the police shootings and the likelihood that they're going to pull the trigger, or do you not have enough data that along those lines yet?
So studies are just starting to come out, but we've got some preliminary evidence that officers are favorable on them. They think that it gives them an opportunity to tell their side of the story after a critical incident. I feel like there's this sense among the public, why wouldn't we just put a camera on all of our cops? Why not, right? Well, it's really, really expensive. And it's not just the cost of the camera, but the cost of storing the data and then going through the data on the back end. So I think that we have to be cautious. I mean, it gives us an opportunity to, obviously it's better, I would suppose, to have a video than to not have a video so that we can see for ourselves. But you still have to be cautious because videos, as we know, can be misleading depending on the angle, the quality of the video, et cetera.
Right. We're talking with Justin Nix, who's a criminal justice professor at the University of Louisville, who's done several studies on police matters, including the one we're talking about right now on shooting of unarmed suspects. Did you find that when you looked at the numbers, at least, were they concentrated in any particular area or not?
So we saw that in fact, almost half of all of the fatal shootings occurred in the southeast region. Which,
really? When you consider southeast, 13 states or 16 states?
Yeah, it's actually 17 states in the District of Columbia. So maybe that's not surprising, given that it's the largest region geographically and probably comprises the highest number of agencies. I don't know off the top of my head, but
yeah.
And then the West came in a close second, and that's probably not surprising either, given agencies like LAPD out west that experienced a higher number of shootings than most other agencies because they deal with a huge population of people.
I would have thought Boston, New York, the Northeast Corridor, Philadelphia.
In fact, what we see is that was by far and away the fewest number of shootings up in the Northeast. And again, the caveat is that it's the smallest region geographically, but also if you look at
population-wise, it's got to be huge.
But if you look at the Guardian's database, which is another similar project separate from the Washington Post, they're tracking all deaths, not just as a result of a shooting. And you see that cities even like New York City aren't very high on the list. And so there's something going on in the Northeast. I don't know if it's a culture thing or if it's a gun thing. I'm not sure. That's something I'm interested in exploring more.
Those 1,000 fatal shootings, those were over what period of time? How many years?
Calendar year of 2015.
So that was 1 year? There were 1,000?
990.
990 police shootings of unarmed.
No, this is just all fatal shootings.
All fatal shootings.
And of those 990, 93 had been unarmed.
Okay. So that's because I left the impression that there were 1,000 that were unarmed. No. So there were less than 100 where the suspects were unarmed.
Yeah, and almost 90% of the time the suspect was in possession of a deadly weapon or was attacking the police or some other suspect. So most of the time, by far and away, the shootings appear to have probably been justifiable, right. Yes.
The first one that I recall that you did was on the, I don't know if you want to call it the so-called Ferguson effect. Was there a drop-off in police actually doing their jobs and a spike in crime after the incident in Ferguson, Missouri? What'd you find?
So the first study we did was carried out about 6 months after Brown's death in Ferguson, and we looked at whether officers felt that they'd been impacted by publicity or media covering negative events, deadly force incidents. And we asked them questions like, do you feel less motivated? Do you feel that the job's gotten more dangerous or more difficult? Do you feel that citizens' views toward the police have gotten worse? And we saw a good bit of variation on those questions. And so, the Ferguson effect seems to be impacting officers, but what we didn't see was that it had a negligible effect on their willingness to engage in community partnerships, which is a key component of, it's a key crime-fighting tool that the police have. And in terms of crime, I wish I could take credit for this study, but I can't. My colleague Scott Wolf and some of his colleagues did the study that looked at the Ferguson effect on crime. And basically, they looked at the largest 81 cities in the country, and they didn't find any increasing or any overall trends that crime was increasing as a result of Ferguson. They saw some isolated effects in cities like Chicago and St. Louis, but on the whole, there's no nationwide crime wave, as some have suggested.
I think you looked at one sheriff's department in Florida, I think it was, wasn't it?
It was in the southeast, is all
Okay,
I'm going to
okay.
divulge,
Well, in the southeast, wherever it was. And so is that a big enough sample size to be able to reach some sort of conclusion about the way police officers are policing in their community?
So that's a fair question. This was an agency that was, over 800 miles removed from Ferguson. So on the one hand, it's an agency far enough away that you might not expect to observe an effect, but we did. But therein lies the challenge of social science. We have to try to get a sample that we can generalize. And so I would argue we do need studies that survey multiple agencies. We need studies that do that over a period of time rather than at one point in time. But I'm confident that, based on that study, others that I've read, and just sort of anecdotally conversations with friends in law enforcement or agencies that I've worked with, that they do feel that this is having an adverse effect on their jobs.
And is it having the adverse effect on the community policing that you mentioned, or what are the very specific things on a day-to-day basis that police may not be doing now that they did before Ferguson?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the idea is that it's the police aren't going to stop responding to calls for service. They're not going to not pick up the phone when you call 911. They're going to answer when you call. But the argument from the Ferguson effect proponents is that they're going to stop going that extra mile. They're not going to be proactive. For example, late at night if they're driving and they see something suspicious, on the one hand they could get out with that suspect and who knows what might happen. They might end up being the next viral video, or they could keep driving and not expose themselves to that potential situation. And so that's the argument, is that they're going to de-police in that way. And if they do that, we might expect crime to go up because there's a lot of research that shows proactive policing is effective. So we don't want them to pull back in that way.
Well, you said that you found, and there's been some studies that have found that police like having the body cameras because it shows what the before and after was of whatever incident might happen. But in this case, you're saying they don't want the cameras on the other folks videotaping what they might do when they just get out of their car and see something going on the street and say, hey, what are you guys doing?
Right.
So there's, they like the video camera as long as it's on them, but not necessarily want to deal with somebody else videotaping their actions on the street. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, and I mean, to be fair, if they answer a call and they're responding to a robbery or some type of serious crime, they're going to want to. I feel that they would want that camera on to help support their story on the back end. But I think what the Ferguson effect is getting at is that they just feel sort of like these viral videos are not very fair. That we immediately
non-context.
Well, and we immediately rush to judge the actions, and that's what's impacting them.
Okay, and let's talk one more study that you've worked on. Was the study about war on cops? Is there a war on cops? Are there more police officers getting shot since Ferguson or not?
So we collected 5 years of data, my colleagues and I, from the Officer Down Memorial page, which is sort of the best, most up-to-date source of line-of-duty police deaths in the United States. And we observed from January of 2010 to March of this year. So we did not capture the Dallas incident. But for that time period anyway, we didn't observe any significant increase in the number of officers fatally attacked in the line of duty. Even though there might be that appearance, the numbers just don't support that conclusion.
I got to be honest, I hadn't heard that. Is that in some police agencies and some police associations? Have they been putting that out there that police are under attack?
Yeah, and the term war on cops has been thrown around before Dallas. It's sort of tied up in this Ferguson effect argument. It's the idea that in this current post-Ferguson era of policing and with the growth of Black Lives Matter, citizens are feeling more empowered to defy the police and perhaps even go the extra step and be physically resistant or even assault the police. So we were interested in this question long before Dallas happened, and certainly now I'm interested in to continue to explore the topic. But for now, I think we can put those concerns to rest.
And I know that you're into numbers and you do research and you want objective data. But what was your feeling? And now it's been a little while since the Dallas incident and these other shootings in different parts of the country where police had shot suspects. Has it changed? Is the tide turning for the worse because of the racial tension in our country between police and the public?
Yeah, it can be hard to try to maintain optimism after a week like last week, and you see reports of officers being attacked during the protests in Minnesota and in Baton Rouge. And I'll say that, again, we're left sort of with more questions than answers because we don't have data on non-fatal or not reliable data on non-fatal attacks of the police. And so I'm concerned that maybe there is something going on or snowballing into something real. But I like to be optimistic and think that this increased attention and focus on policing is going to, in the long run, lead to more accountability and more weeding out of wrongdoing where it does occur. And so I think that we should absolutely hold the police accountable when wrongdoing does occur. And I hope that we're trending in that direction.
And I think most folks would tell you, even those that aren't big fans of the police department, that the police departments, that you're talking 1% of police officers. The more overwhelming majority are trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, I would say even less than that. I mean, the police make millions and millions of contact with people every day, and force occurs in less than 0.001% of those incidents. So it's very, very rare. But it gets a lot of attention when it does occur.
And back to our, the original study that you talked about, there appears to be some bias built in with police officers, at least, to be more fearful of black suspects than they are of white suspects. Correct?
Right. And the big point there is that, it might not even be intentional. It's unconscious that they don't even have control over it, that they have this greater fear or perceived threat in those situations.
Okay. Anything coming down the pike anything else you're working on? Obviously, I think a lot of guys, like researchers in your shoes, are going to be looking at this Dallas, the shootings in Dallas, and is there going to be a spike in, as you put it, more folks going after the police and not being afraid?
One thing that I'm concerned about is there's, some allegations out there by Campaign Zero and other movements that allege that the police, not only are they not killing fewer people post-Ferguson, they're actually killing more people. And so what they'll do is, what's today's date is July 12th or 13th. They'll say, up to date this year, there's been X number of killings, and to the same day of last year, there were fewer, and oh my goodness, they're killing more people. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to compare it that way. And so my colleagues and I have submitted another paper for publication where we do an analysis of the 66 weeks before Ferguson and the 72 afterward to see if police killings have significantly gone up or down or what they've done. And what we see is they've remained relatively stable. I think it's just that we think they're going up because we're more tuned in and it's more covered in the media than it's ever been. And so it just feels that way. But the reality is that it doesn't appear to be changing.
And there needs to be accountability of police officers, as you said. Do you think that has happened in Louisville, Kentucky? You've been here for how long? How long have you been here?
And almost, just over 1 year.
Oh, okay. So you don't know the history, okay. So
it'd be hard for me to speculate.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I shouldn't ask you. I shouldn't have asked you that question. I've got a history here, 22 years of being a reporter and then 7 at the University of Louisville, so I got a little background.
You're right.
Probably a little more than you do.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Justin, anything else you want to add about in general about these studies of police shootings and the work that the police do on the streets?
Let's just continue to search for the truth, and let's not rush to conclusions. Let's not, let's not jump to conclusions. Let's study this thing and figure out what's going on.
All right. Justin Nix from the University of Louisville Criminal Justice Department. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
With me now is Dr. Allan Josephson, who is with the UofL Physicians. He's with UofL Child Psychiatry, and he also does some family therapy. He's a jack of all trades, right, Dr. Josephson?
Well, there are a number of things in my job description, that's for sure, yeah.
All right. Well, I wanted to have you on the program to talk about the anxiety that some parents may be feeling right now. Their baby's going off to college. It's about that time of the year. So what would you tell parents who are about to have a kid walk out the door?
Well, I think it's like so many things in life. If you've done your homework and you've been prepared and done the things that have gotten you this far, you'll be fine. I think kids who've been in families that have met their developmental needs, is a term that we use, all the way along, will do just fine. However, it is one of life's major transitions, and because we're all different individuals, we respond to it differently as parents and adults.
What percentage of adults, or you can't even put a marker on that, or parents, when their first goes off to college, or maybe their last is even worse when they're getting ready to do the empty nester syndrome, what percentage of those have, serious stuff going on? Depression, real bad anxiety, those kinds of things.
Well, that's an interesting question because the specific numbers probably aren't there. However, I would estimate, in my experience, maybe 5 to 10%.
Okay, well, that's a pretty good chunk of parents then.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. And I think one of the challenges I think is the perspective that people have when they bring this to parenting. I found it very useful to keep the idea that your kids really aren't yours; they're on loan. We think of them as our children because they have our last name and so forth. But when you have a child, you're beginning to prepare them right from day one to be their own independent adult. And that's the success of a family is how you produce those independent adults who contribute to society. So at some level, you're always preparing for them to be gone. But I think those parents who've invested maybe a lot in their kids, more in their kids than in their own lives, if their marriages fall apart and they get shifted away from a mate, then they reinvest in children. There are all kinds of dynamics that put more pressure on kids, and then when they leave, parents are more distressed and depressed and anxious.
Is the empty nester syndrome really something that causes parents to go into a fairly serious, or can it, a very serious depression or anxiety?
Well, the empty nest syndrome is basically just the range of emotions that people have when there are no children around.
Right.
And
I'm an empty nester, just so you know, so if I do something wacky on this program, you know what happened.
No. I think the other thing about kids leaving, though, is it's really mostly positive. It's mixed feelings. I think that's what we're talking about here today. But when you think of the positive part of graduation is a celebration, it's a great thing. It's a thing that kids have achieved. And so parents and everybody should feel good about it. But when they're gone, what it does is it reveals strengths and weaknesses in the individual and in the marriage. So if you've invested more in your child's life than you have in your own life, in your own marriage, in your own career, other things, then there's a deep sense of loss when they go, and people can be go into a tailspin, to speak.
All right. We're talking with Dr. Allan Josephson. He's with the UofL Physicians, UofL Child Psychiatry. He also does some family therapy. Where do these issues rank on the number of patients that you see when they come in with a problem and they want to talk to you as a family therapist? Losing the kids or sending the kids off to college, where does that rank on, money, marriage, those kinds of things?
Well, children are a fundamental part of families and really what form a family. I often ask my students, if you don't have children, do you have a family? And there's a vigorous debate sometimes, but one could argue that you have a couple or a relationship, but without a child, there's not a family. And so they're central. And you want to balance. There's a certain period of time, the younger years, of course, where parenting is all of life. But then that should shift, and it's only part of life as one moves along. So the persons who have low self-esteem, who have marriages that aren't doing well, who maybe feel they can't go into the workplace and get a job that they'd like, to then be without children is a major stress for them. But it's usually not a reason directly why they would come into the hospital.
But most parents are more worried, I'm assuming, about money issues, marital issues, those kinds of things, and the kid issue is just an offshoot of it.
Right. No, and as mentioned at the outset, in a healthy family, I think children, when they're raised according to what the developmental stage is needed. So they get nurtured earlier on, they get shown academic things later on, they get launched later on when they're in adolescence. If you go through every one of those things appropriately, then you're in good shape when they're adults. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the kids. Let's flip the coin here a little bit. You've got a number of 18 and 19-year-olds getting ready to head off to college here in probably August, and a lot of them are going to be out of the house for the first time. Right. Maybe they're going out of state to stay for the first time for any length of time. What kind of advice and counsel do you give to those kids?
Well, I think you want them to see both sides of the equation. In other words, help them see that they may have two types of feelings. One is aware of the first type. I'm finally on my own. I can determine my own schedule. There's no one checking what I'm doing or if I'm in or so forth. And that
I'm free.
That sense of freedom, that's the correct word, you bet. That sense of freedom is really pretty exhilarating and nice and all to the good. It's part of becoming an adult. But they often have a second set of feelings that they don't realize the security, the structure, the comfort that they get from being around the people that created them and nurtured and helped them. And so a lot of them don't want to admit it, but they miss the family. And so you are in a stage where you have both those feelings going on. And again, if you've done the right things, you handle it fine. But there are some kids, let's say, that have been overly close with their parents. And when they go away to school or college, they get blown out of the water because they're not ready for independence. There are also other kids who've not had a lot of support and kind of raised themselves, so to speak. And when they are on their own, they flounder too many times.
How long does it take either parents to get over the fact that they don't have any kids running around the house, they're not going to the kids' lacrosse and baseball games after work? How long does it take a parent to get over that? And then how long does it take a student that we just described assimilate into college and, finally decide, I'm not homesick anymore. I can live without mom and dad?
It's a great question. I would say really 4 to 6 months. It's a major transition, but halfway through that first year, there's a recognition of the new world, and that you can't go back, and no one really wants to go back. I remember in my own family that first time when there were no children around, the days seemed so quiet, and then my wife and I kind of liked it because there was a sense of freedom for us. We could go do things that our own schedule wanted to do, and not feeling we had to respond to the kids. I will say this, though, that now that I have the parent of 3 adult children, there's really very few things that are as pleasing or as powerful as being the parent of an adult child who's making it. And so all you parents out there who are doing all this work to prepare that for that day, keep at it, because once that day comes, it's a little late, and there's a tremendous sense of gratification, to say, my kid's making it. He's doing okay. She's doing okay.
Great advice. Got about a minute left. One more question I had. We often hear about helicopter parents.
Yes.
And, that they're way too involved in their kids' lives, too much patting them on the back and holding their hands. Then the kids go away to college. So what do you tell, or what advice would you give for those parents and for the rest of us, perhaps, that could help us not be helicopter parents? Or would you say keep the strings attached to the kid at least a little bit? Or should you just say, you know what, you got to go cold turkey? It would be best for your kid if you just sent them off to college and let them learn it on their own. What would you tell them?
Well, great question, and one that deserves a fair bit of thought. But I think
you got about 30 seconds.
Yeah,
so
all right.
I'm glad I could give that to you.
I'll be quick. I think that you don't want to do too many things for your kids. You don't want to give them too much praise. You may give them realistic praise, and give them an opportunity to try things on their own. And I would emphasize the word transition. You don't give them cold turkey, but transition to being kind of independent. If there's one thing that many parents do to a detriment these days, is contribute to their child's problems by always praising them, because that doesn't happen in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen in the real world.
Right. It does not, as my kids have learned.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Allan Josephson from ULP and UofL Child Psychiatry, thanks for being on. Appreciate it.
All right.
So earlier in the show, we talked about police training issues. So here's today's Did You Know segment about the University of Louisville. In 1951, the Southern Police Institute was founded at UofL. And in the early 1960s, curriculum shifted to more instruction in police administration, personnel management, social and behavioral sciences, and criminal and constitutional law. And the SBI became the first school of its type in the U.S. to offer college credit for in-service police education. So cops across the country and across the world, actually, are getting training at the Southern Police Institute at the University of Louisville. All right, you can watch the video version of this program every week on Metro TV, which is Louisville's government access channel. It airs about 5 times a week. And on KET3 Thursdays at 5 o'clock. You can find the audio versions of these programs on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/UofL. So we just really want to thank you folks for listening to the program. Go Cards.